Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with the wonderful Michael P. Lynch. Michael is Provost Professor of the Humanities and Board of Trustees, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. He has his PhD in philosophy from Syracuse University, and his work mostly centers around studying truth, ethics, democracy, and the epistemology of technology. He's the author of numerous books, including the most recent, On Truth in Politics, Why Democracy Demands It. Now, I will have to just make a quick footnote here. As we mentioned in the conversation, Michael recently had surgery on his throat, and so his voice is a bit hoarse. And so if you notice anything as we kind of, warmly tease, he's not in any pain. So he was actually wonderful, and if not for the recent throat surgery, I would have loved to have stolen another hour from him because the conversation was just that good. We talk about local and national politics, defining truth. His example he has in the book, the Twitbookians, which was great. I loved how he used that throughout the book and in the conversation. Liberal pluralism, the role of institutions, Rawls and morals, truth in politics, and many, many other topics. Again, this was such a wonderful conversation. I've been a fan of Michael's work for a long time. He's great. His book is great. And so I highly recommend a lot of his work. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues at Substack.com. Also on YouTube. So subscribe, share with your friends. And now I bring you Michael P. Lynch. I am here with Michael Patrick Lynch. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really, really thrilled to be talking with you. So it's a big thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, certainly. So you got another wonderful book out through the always wonderful Princeton University Press. The book is On Truth in Politics, Why Democracy Demands It. Critical on the demands there, so we'll talk about that. Before we get into it, why don't you tell listeners just a snapshot of who you are professionally, academically, and all the relevant details?
Sure. I'm a philosopher. I teach at the University of Connecticut. Throughout the history of my career, I've thought a lot about truth, a lot about politics, but rarely together. And I've also written books on the internet and worked on AI and on intellectual humility.
Yeah, I mean, I know you for writing about truth, so it was nice to read you again on truth. So I know you've touched those, you touched democracy, so it is nice to kind of get you square on this issue. Now, just I guess for listeners. I know you mentioned to me, so that's why I mentioned it, just so listeners are alerted to it. I know you've had some vocal kind of challenges recently. I think some procedures done. So I just want to highlight that for listeners, and that you're feeling okay, you're feeling fine. That I don't have you handcuffed to the table here saying like must talk with me about this while you're in recovery. So, but yeah, just tell
Not
listeners
yet,
if you want.
anyway. Not yet. Maybe that comes later.
That comes later.
Yeah.
What was you just had like a procedure or something recently? Is what it was?
Yeah, I had some surgery in my trachea, which unfortunate, but luckily it was successful.
That's good.
And just dealing with the after effects.
Yeah, and so for listeners, you're, as far as I know, you're not in any pain. So this isn't a painful conversation. So at least not for your throat. Maybe for your brain or something later. But so
yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
Not yet. Later. We'll see.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I guess the big question here is just kind of out the gate. We'll talk about truth and stuff. Obviously, that's a big question. Not really philosophers have talked about the idea of truth and different dimensions of it for thousands of years. But I guess just to kind of start, because kind of in the subtitle of the book, democracy demands truth. How do you see this marriage between truth and democracy? How do you see them intertwined? And And why do you think democratic politics is not the thing that pushes truth aside?
Well, first, let me just address the elephant in the room, which is that most of us don't generally think politics goes together with truth, right? Let alone democratic politics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as many people say when they hear the title, and this was intentional on my part, is that truth and politics, that'll be a short book, right? So, fair enough. Moreover, as you just pointed out, there's sort of a train in philosophical thought going back to Plato, that democracy is really at odds with the idea that there are right answers and wrong answers in politics, truth and falsity. After all, you might think, isn't democracy all about just voting on the right answer? And nobody really thinks that we just create truth by voting on it. So, it's a good question. And it's really the animating question of the book. But to address it, the first thing we need to realize in this context is that when I'm talking about democracy in this book, I'm talking about something that is a practice, a way of engaging in politics, not a form of government. Democracy is a kind of government. But I'm more interested in what I call, with a little d, democratic politics, by which I mean the politics of deliberating together, rationally, to solve common problems. That's a kind of politics that can sometimes happen in a democratic form of government, but sometimes can happen outside of it, like in a committee or in a, just within a group of friends. And it can happen or not happen in, let's say, our present country. So, I'm not talking about the structure of government and truth. I'm talking about what Dewey called democracy as a way of life. And there, to really get to your question, when you talk about trying to solve common problems with rational deliberation, with reasons, Xavier, you're basically requiring citizens who engage in that way of doing politics to appeal to reasons for their belief. And to appeal to reasons for beliefs is to appeal to evidence. And to appeal to evidence is to talk about truth.
Let me kind of give a. We're having this conversation in the middle of 2025, so let me give you my cynical question, my follow up here. Okay, this idea of like the polis, right? The politics of people getting together to make decisions about how they want to live in their community, live life together. I mean, that's literally the how we define politics, like at its fundamental. And I guess, do you think that there's a space where maybe now, I don't know, maybe now that only works in local governments? I live in a small town. I don't live in a big town. Maybe we go to a small town, we 7, 8, 10,000 people, or even, whatever, 20,000. But, people get together at City Hall. People, we elect local government officials to kind of run things, a mayor and a, school board, or whatever it is. And, we have a community and we talk about, does the sidewalk get paved? And, do we build this in the school? And do we, have that new, whatever. That feels right and appropriate and necessary. But when you scale that, do you find that maybe democratic politics, small d in the literal sense, is maybe just too big now? It's too, we can't scale it anymore for 350 million people, let's say, with 50 states and 8 territories or whatever it is, and so many different. Even if we had a homogenized group in the United States, it was mostly 1 or 2 big, groups or whatever. Which we don't. I don't even know if that would be possible. You just have different people with different ideas, but then of course you get people from different backgrounds, all these things. I don't know. What do you think about? Do you have an optimistic view on if we could still do democratic politics at scale with all of these, kind of warring factions about how people want to do or not do things?
Okay. So first of all, I'm a philosopher. And so being cynical is sort of my job description.
I'm a psychologist, so I'm also cynical.
Right.
I'm trying to find psychopathology in everybody.
But look, I want to push back on how you framed the question.
Please.
When we ask, can we scale up democratic politics as we're talking about it? Mm-hmm. Implicitly, that question is, can we scale it up perfectly? The answer to that, you already know.
Right.
Everybody listening to it already knows that.
Right.
The answer is no. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even work perfectly, as you well know. I also live in a small New England town. It doesn't work perfectly on the local level.
No.
It doesn't work perfectly when you're trying to decide fairly, democratically, where to go to dinner with a big group of friends.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
People are not perfect. Deliberation is not perfect. Large part of this book is about making that point over and over again. That, however, that thought that humanity is built, as Kant said, out of crooked timber. We're weak, we're poor reasoners, we're biased, we don't play well with others, etc., etc. None of that should dissuade us from doing what we can to do better, which we can. How do I know that? Same reason that all of us do. Look, when we talk about practicing democratic politics, when the rubber hits the road, we talk practically. We're talking about constructing institutions and rules for those institutions that help us fight our natural tendencies to be jerks to each other, right? And to favor only our own interests. What sort of institutions? Well, there's the obvious ones, like the structure of democratic government itself, checks and balances. Checks and balances are about trying to fight our tendency to grab power. That's what it's about.
Yeah.
Does it work perfectly? Hell no. But there's other sorts of institutions on a micro scale that we have a tendency to overlook, and which I talk about in the book. Those are the institutions and structures that in the book I call our epistemic infrastructure. Just as we have infrastructure to get us physically where we want to go. We also have infrastructure that helps us deliberate better, to solve problems in a more rational way. What's that infrastructure? Well, the schools for one, scientific institutions for another. the practice of history by local museums and big museums. The structures of legal investigation and the norms and rules that operate on these. One of the big threats that I talk about in the book right now to democracy is also a threat to those institutions that help us deliberate together more rationally, that help us pursue the truth. Science helps us get better information so we can make better decisions. Same with history. Same with the law. It's not all they do, but that's one of the things they do. Those little institutions, not little in the metaphorically, they're not like the entire U.S. government. They can't be pursued, by the way, by everyone, right? You talked about scale. Part of democratic politics is realizing that just like with bridges and roads, we need experts to build those things. And they're going to be different in different communities, right? In some communities near the water, you're going to need bridges, you're going to need ferries. In other communities near mountains, you're going to need tunnels. We don't talk about scaling up tunnels, right? Like, how is everybody going to use tunnels? Well, the point is you use them some places, not others, to address some problems, not others. The same goes for our epistemic infrastructure, our way of collecting information to better deliberate about our common problems.
Yeah, so that's very nicely said. I do like that. Yeah, you talk a lot about different types of epistemic features, which will hit for sure. So I want to ask about one big kind of sort of analogy you give early in the book, but I guess before that, I mean, I don't know how you want to take it, but how do you give me your operational definition of truth? I mean,
Sure.
And what are some of the dimensions of it?
That's actually a pretty easy one.
Okay.
Simplistically, from the common way of thinking about it, to say that something's true, like a thought or belief or judgment, is to say that it accords with reality. It's the right answer to a question, right? Now, to put a little bit more meat on that, look, there's two things you really need to know to sort of know what I mean by truth. First, believing doesn't make it so. Just because you believe that such and such is the case doesn't mean it's true. And there's probably going to be, in fact, there will be, some things that are true that we won't be able to believe or ever know. There's, right, more under heaven and earth than dreamt of in your PowerPoint presentation, to paraphrase Hamlet. So, put those two things together, and you have a pretty good idea what I mean by true. Now, that being said, as you know, in the book, there's a lot more to say, philosophically, about what that amounts to, in politics or in science.
Yeah.
And I spent a career doing that. But that's about the metaphysical details of truth, not what I mean by it. So, what I mean by true is the same thing that everybody else means by it, I think. Which is, say that something's true means it accords with reality. The hard bits are, what does it mean to accord, and what's reality?
I was gonna say, yeah,
Those are the hard bits.
yeah, you're
But that takes us
attaching
into deep
truth to
philosophy.
yeah,
Right.
you're it's tethered to reality, but
course
you know,
it is.
reality can get pretty
Funky.
tough, and that can start to become almost an ontological kind of conversation as well.
Of course
right?
it is.
So
Much of the book amounts to saying what reality is for politics, which is not an easy question,
no,
right?
it's not.
And there's a lot of hard work in the book done just answering that question. But in order to understand the sort of basic problem of the book, you just need to understand the basic meaning of the word true.
Yeah.
Understand the answers in the book. You need to go deeper.
Yeah, no, that's good. So the example you gave at the beginning is of the Twitbookians. I'm assuming
Yes.
this is a combination of Twitter and Facebook. That was how I took it.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Give,
So it's
give
not to
us
offend anyone, but to offend everyone.
right. Give us kind of just briefly lay us out the example you give in the book of these
Sure.
folks and how you use it to understand different elements of truth in politics.
Look. Okay. So, imagine a society, call them the Twitbookians, who are politically engaged just like us, politically polarized just like us, but have one and only one rule that they follow when talking politics. That rule is only say or boast online, because they're really online. Only say or boast political things that are liked by your friends and disliked by your enemies. That's the one rule. But here's the thing about the Twitbookians. They don't know this about themselves. They think, and they'll tell everybody, that when they post stuff about politics, they are guided only by the facts, only by the evidence. When in reality, although they don't know this, they're never motivated by the facts. And they never really care about the evidence. They just care about whether their posts fit with the opinions of their side. Now, this is sort of a dark thought, disturbing thought. The disturbing thought is, how much are we like Twitbookians?
I was going to say, you're just describing our current reality.
Exactly. Exactly. What I find is that most people who hear this tend to get divided into two groups. Some people say, oh yeah, I know those sorts of people. Those are the people on the other side of the fence. Not like us. And there's other people like you who say, oh, you're just describing all of us, right? Now, either way, it's a dark thought. Because even if only half of us are like the Twitbookians, that's a challenge to democratic politics. And if, and here I agree with you, we're all inclined to be Twitbookians, how are we gonna ever practice democratic politics? Now think through the Twitbookians a little bit. Twitbookians, how democratic can their politics be? Well, it could be formally democratic. They could go out and vote for stuff, right? No problem there. And they pay lip service to truth. But really, because they're never motivated by evidence, they don't really deliberate together, do they? They don't really think about what the evidence really shows. They just go along with whatever fits their pre-existing opinions, whether it fits the evidence or not.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, they're never really giving reasons to each other. They're just sort of barking at each other across the aisle. And as you say, that sounds like our present politics, which is my way of saying our present politics aren't very democratic.
Mm-hmm.
And one reason they're not democratic, not the only reason, is because we're acting Twitbookian. And why are we? Well, that's a good question, which we can talk about.
Mm. You know, I'm thinking about this. I mean, I loved it in the book because you kind of continue with pulling from it throughout the book. What it seems is, in theory, for democratic politics, you would want a type of liberal pluralism. You would want some, what you all do in New England, aside from clam chowder and some good lobster, is going to be different than what we do down here in the great state of Maryland. We have good crabs and a bunch of other things, and so or whatever, right? But in terms of how we do our politics, of how we organize, of how we do things, and if people are just creating their own, if you will, echo chambers, and they're appealing to their confirmation bias, I guess the question about that becomes, of sorts, why? Let me give an example. Recently there was I mean, you would have thought this person won the whole thing, but there was the Democratic candidate for mayor in New York City is this guy who's got a diverse background, and he's young, and all of these different things, and he has the label of Democratic Socialist, and he's got some eye-catching ideas, government-run grocery stores or whatever it is. And a few people I know, I mean, a handful of people I've been, I guess, talking about it, and a few people I know that live in other states were saying, we're kind of, at the very least, to be charitable here, they were critiquing his ideas and critiquing some of how left-leaning he is, and critiquing a little bit of the, the effectiveness of these things, and so on and so forth, and all these things. And my question to this was, I mean, we can kind of talk about these things and think about them or whatever, but I mean, to be honest, I don't really give a shit. I mean, I don't live in New York City. What New York City does is what New York City does. I mean, the people voted for him. They, majority, quote unquote, like him. And, if he wins the mayor, I mean, okay, good for New York. They tried that out. They've certainly tried it different ways. And what Seattle does, and what Hartford, Connecticut, and Boston, and what, people in my state do, everyone's going to do a little bit different. But it just seems that people have to, go at each other about it, on how other people decide to do things. And there's, look, we, some people might sit here and criticize how, the state of Florida does things, right? It's very, kind of pretty right nowadays, and has been really for 25 years. Okay, that's how they do it. If you don't like it, you don't have to live there. That's the wonderful thing about living in a big country with different things. But it seems that people sometimes have a hard time, for various reasons, of this liberal pluralism of saying, well, people want to do it that way. People voted for it that way. Well, that's a way to do it. And you can go to different parts of the country. We have a big country, a lot of people, and you can do it a different way. I just don't, people criticize California as well because, it's very liberal and it has all these problems and all these things. It's like, well, I mean, they have voted in some ways for those people to keep having and fostering those ideas. Whatever it is, why do you think it is that people sometimes they like the idea of liberal pluralism, but when you actually do it, they have a difficult time kind of holding all of these kind of things at the same time? What do you think is there with that?
Well, that's a deep question. And a good question.
This is the part where the part of the conversation now where is the brain starts to kind
of yeah, because we've been talking about such trivial ideas as truth
right,
so
right,
far.
yeah, we got that figured
And
out.
very lightweight so far.
Yeah.
But look, I have a lot of things to say to that, but let's start with a basic paradox of democratic politics. It's really partly reflected in, like, the slogan, out of many one, right? Democracy is inherently, and its critics, like from Plato onwards, have always pointed this out, that it seems sort of incoherent from the get-go, that it's tolerating, even fostering disagreement, right? Pluralism. But still has to, democracies have to figure out collectively what to do. And that results in this disagreement. You need sort of unity to get together to make decisions. But you're not going to agree on those decisions. So at heart, there's a sort of paradox. Not a formal paradox, not like a logical paradox, but a conundrum. Now, the ways in which we set up our democracies are meant to address that problem. One of the things you just pointed to is in this country, in many democracies around the globe, we leave regions of the country some autonomy to decide for themselves how to address local problems. That's one way, sort of try to mitigate the issue. So California has different problems, different environment, different populace than Connecticut, or Florida, or Tennessee. So, naturally, the idea is the local problems should be solved. But, you've noted, especially nowadays, people seem, and actually always, people are uncomfortable with the fact that people in other parts of the country might reach different solutions to the same problem. Why? Well, part of it is the sort of perennial issue is that people, and this has been true for the whole country, people fear that the ideas they disagree with will start to leak into their regions, right? Oh, the socialists are coming for us all. Help, help, run for the hills, right?
Yeah.
Similarly on the other side, right? But that's always been true, right? People are sort of fearmonger. I think more recently, and this relates to the Twitbookians that caused you to ask this question, right? We were talking about the Twitbookians. Twitbookians are obviously modeled after the social mediaification of our political discourse. Social media, and the internet generally, was originally thought, back in the day, I'm old enough to remember. In fact, I used to write about this. Oh, the internet is going to democratize knowledge. It's going to make our politics so much more democratic. People like me actually used to believe that 25 years ago. It's hard to believe now, right? Because the reverse has turned out to be true. Because most conversations on the internet are not like this, right? Sure, they're podcasts, and that's good. They can often be, some of them could be good, some of them maybe not so much. But most political discourse is via X, via Instagram, or nowadays, especially if you're a certain age, via TikTok.
Correct.
And those media are designed, as you well know, by algorithms whose sole purpose is to make people stay on the platform.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we know about how those algorithms work? Well, you get people to stay on the platform if you tap into their emotions. One way to do that is by cute kitten videos, right? Kittens, puppies. They make people feel warm, fuzzy. They'll stay on the platform. Another way to do it turns out to be even more effective, is to make people pissed off. I mean, there's a lot of data on this that I talk about in the book.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody listening to this needs, I mean, we all know that. So, moreover, our social media feeds are personalized.
Yeah.
They're designed to cultivate the bubbles you were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that do when it comes to politics? Well, it means that what happened in New York suddenly gets translated through the lens of your feed, whatever that feed is. If you're worried about socialism, or you disagree with it, or your political partisans disagree with it, then you're gonna be fed information that aligns with that view, even if you're a highly critical, thoughtful person. Doesn't matter how thoughtful you are. I mean, the algorithms don't care whether you're thoughtful or not.
Mm-hmm.
They work the same way and just as effectively. So what that means, I think, is that it contributes to the nationalization of local politics, phenomenon you know well. Politics on the local level. Look, I told you I live in a small New England town. New England, we still have very direct democracy. Our town budget is decided in the first place at a town hall where you physically show up.
Mm-hmm.
You actually talk in person about the budget, and you get to make amendments in person to the budget. I mean, it's a very deliberate, very old-fashioned, and as you said, it works in very tiny groups. But in my town, towns across New England, that process has been corrupted by social media. People now don't show up for the meetings. They talk about the politics on Facebook.
Yeah.
There are people who live in my town, both on the right and the left. I'm not making this up. Who say things like on Facebook, why can't we just talk about this and vote on this in person? You're like, people, that's literally what we do. Right? So look, like our town budget is now filtered for some people through national politics. They think about decisions like how much to spend on the schools or whether to put in a walking trail in the woods. They literally talk about that in terms of Trump, for or against. That's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem you're getting at. And it shows how our politics has become Twitbookian. And it also shows why we need better epistemic infrastructure. And it's not an easy problem to solve.
No, it's not. It's not. And you know, myself, I'm a pragmatic institutionalist. That's what I like. I think that makes a lot of sense to do. It's not very sexy online, and it's not going to get all the clicks. But I mean, that's somebody, you have to do that work. And there's something to be said about, activism or awareness. But, at the end of the day, if more people were as zealous about, reforming institutions as they were about various activist stuff, we'd be much better off, I think, in a lot of ways. You were saying something about, we were talking about a bit about the pluralism piece, and people will get elected or things will happen. It reminds me briefly of this conversation I had with, it's been a couple years, give me a minute, Juliet Hooker. She's a professor at Brown, and she writes a lot about race relations, things like that. But she wrote this book, somewhere the title is The Politics of Loss. And she was like, what's endogenous to democracy is losing. And people forget that when you have a democracy and that you have people that vote on something and they agree on something and you get the majority wins, but there's the other side or sides that don't, right? We don't do coalition governments here, which is, people still lose in some ways, but whatever. It's the idea here is,
oh, they certainly do. Yeah.
Sort of majority here. And if you're for democracy, you have to be accepting of losing. And most people do not. I didn't really put that together, actually. And she was, I think, using it in the context of certain things with I think, race relations. But just generally, she was talking about the idea of, generally, democracy does have kind of losing. It happens often, actually, for people. And, so you can be for democracy, but there's a piece of that. And how you accept that and handle and deal with that and work with that is also really instructive and really, really important. So I guess you can chat about that if you want as well, but I guess the other piece of this here is how, if so much of many people, we don't have this truth that's aligning with reality, and a lot of things do feel performative. I mean, do you think there's a danger in having too much reliance or leaning on what Hochschild says is the deep stories, right? She's great. I had a conversation with her on here, and she's lovely, and I agree with her. But I think sometimes we like our ideas too much, or we like our stories or narratives too much, and when that happens, it starts to become too performative, or there's a darker underbelly to that, where it's like, now we're just believing the fiction and not the reality, and it does become sort of performative and stuff. What do you say about that?
Well, I say that's exactly what I'm getting at when I say our politics have become too Twitbookian. Because the Twitbookians only believe their narrative, their deep story, that is, their ideological explanation of what matters, right? And their story of themselves is perhaps the ones that are victimized, or the ones that are going to triumph in the end. All of us have political deep stories or narratives, ideologies, worldviews, to put it bluntly. Mm-hmm. And those worldviews are often connected with our identities. So it becomes a threat to ourselves when people threaten our worldviews. When our worldviews become part of ourselves, then of course we're going to push aside evidence to the contrary, because that evidence against our worldview is somehow a direct threat to who we are.
But most people can't find the kind of the breaker for that. They can't. It's very hard when you have strong beliefs, and you could do this on any side of the spectrum. People they do personalize it, and they put part of their identity. I mean, that's a human thing. And listen, I'm fully with you. I think people need to have some sort of delineation or some sense of separation, but just most people don't do that.
Of course. And the reason they don't do it is because I say in the book I don't put it quite this bluntly, but roughly speaking, we're psychologically hardwired to take on these narratives. That doesn't mean it's inevitable, right? But it means that we're sort of prone to buy these stories, to look for these deep sort of big explanations for why the world is the way it is, politically speaking. But, and this is where it gets back to your point about institutions, my point earlier about epistemic infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I quoted Kant earlier, saying that we're constructed out of crooked timber. We're not perfect. Again, that's why democracy works when we have institutions and rules that are set up to correct for our tendency to be biased in favor of our own stories. That's why we ask our scientists to review their studies by their peers, blind review. What's the point of having other scientists anonymously review scientific research to correct for bias? Is it perfect? No. Does it work? Yeah, better than nothing. Why is it that we want our judges to recuse themselves from cases where they have an interest to correct for bias? Is it perfect? No. Does it work? Yeah. Why do we want our journalists to use more than one source for a story to correct for bias? All these are attempts to get at better evidence, to get at the truth more accurately. All of them are designed to correct for our tendency to buy into narratives, to believe what favors those narratives. Now look, we're living at a time, right now, where epistemic infrastructure is under real threat. And it's under attack in two ways. First, I've already talked about the social mediaification of our political life. I think we'll all agree that big picture has not been good. It's led to polarization in a major way. It's led to making everything political. Everything has become political now. Not just local politics, becoming national. But everything you wear, everything you drink, words that you say, all now are viewed through the lens of our narratives. They have what I call in the book political meaning. That's a problem. But we can fight back against that. I mean, Jonathan Haidt, for example, has been doing good work helping to convince people to get the phones, cell phones, iPhones, smartphones, out of schools. They don't help either with their politics or with learning, right? Now that's it's a complicated question, but what I'm saying is an example of where we can actually push back against the social mediaification of politics. Second thing is, the other threat is ideology. You were talking about the fact that democracy only works if we believe in its institutions, including the institution of democracy itself, which as at its heart requires you to obey the rule of law. And the first among those laws is you peacefully go along with the decision of the democratic, either majority or whatever the democratic mechanism is, Like in New York City, rank voting. That's a democratic procedure, right? The point is, if you lose, you concede. 5 years ago, January 6th, we showed what happened. We saw what happened when social mediatification of our culture met an ideology that was not really big on conceding. That basically says, according to that ideology, you only concede if you're a sucker. Right? According to that ideology, you can't lose. That it's impossible for your side to lose. That if you lose, that means things were rigged. And if you win, it means things were fair. That's not democratic. Now, people on the right might point out that, hey, Democrats talk like that too sometimes. Yeah, they do, actually. But right now, in our country right now, I think there is an ideology that's propagated right now by a certain section of the right, which explicitly says that democracy is the enemy. That ideology plus social media combined with our natural crooked timber is a toxic mess and a toxic threat to the pursuit of truth and to democracy, both at the same time.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there.
I told you I was cynical.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah. The current climate, though, is a softball to be cynical at this point.
One would think. But look, a lot of the people who are serious about this far-right ideology, and there are a lot of people. I mean, serious about it in the sense that they write about it. Talk about it. They're not cynical about it. They think it's
great.
the best hope for humanity.
Yeah.
They think it's great. They think, with Plato, the democracy always ends up sort of confused and bankrupt. Democracy just doesn't work. A lot of young people believe this now. College students, not everybody, not most people. But I've talked to a lot of very smart young people who are like, democracy at its time, it doesn't work. We need another tactic. So they're not cynical about it. Also, I want to point out, and I'm sorry I jumped in here.
No, go ahead.
But all joking aside, I do have hope for democracy. I have hope for the pursuit of truth. Because while it is that individual human beings, like you, like me, despite what we may think, are often biased, not particularly great, figuring things out as we like to think. At least you are. I'm not. Even though that's the case, when human beings work together in good faith to solve problems, it's amazing what we can do. There's still hope for that. And there's still hope if we have renewed faith, not just in ourselves, not just in the possibility of having humility in the face of other people's opinions.
Mm-hmm.
But also if we have some renewed faith in the institutions that I've talked about here, in the institutions that we humans have set up to help us reach better decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're not perfect, these institutions, but they can be rebuilt. And I have hope that on the other side of that rebuilding, that renewal, we'll find a more democratic future.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I fully agree. I'm a big believer in institutions, and it's so funny how you'll find folks like yourself, me. I know other people that are center left, center right, kind of down the middle, and they all kind of say the same thing. They'll say, "Yeah, we gotta figure out how we fix some of these institutions," which I think is right. I guess the kind of some of the things that you were saying, building off some of what you were saying there, was in the book you talk about Rawls and his use of political liberalism and how it doesn't require truth but reasonableness for political judgments. And you also talk about after that about how autonomy and respect give you democratic reasons for valuing true beliefs. And I'm just curious about some of Rawls' ideas about this. I can remember. Maybe you may have read the book by Alexander Lefebvre. He wrote Liberalism as a Way of Life. It came out a year or two ago. I don't remember. And we had a nice conversation on here, and we had a nice disagreement about the role of I guess Christianity or Christendom and Western democracy and all these things like that. And so, but he also, he loves Rawls, and so he talks about elements of this as well, about with liberalism and politics. How do you see, where he wanted reasonableness for political judgment, and where do you see, autonomy and respect as being important?
Right. So, Rawls, Theory of Justice, big book, big philosopher, born philosopher. In this context, when we're talking about truth and democratic politics, Rawls matters because lots of people cite him, incorrectly in my view, but cite him as claiming that truth is not a democratic value. That actually, the pursuit of truth, while might be important, has no role in political democratic discourse. Now, as a matter of fact, he says lots of things that sound just like that. To the extent that he believes it. And I'm not going to come down on, Rawls' interpretation is like Wittgenstein interpretation. It's complicated and filled with camps. But look,
I do love Wittgenstein though. Rawls is important, but Wittgenstein I do enjoy.
Wittgenstein is the man.
Yeah.
But to the extent that Rawls does think that, I disagree with him. What Rawls, at least on the surface, many people think they say, is that what we need to appeal to is the idea that when we're deciding what to do together, if we respect each other as free and equal citizens, we need to be reasonable with each other. That is, offer reasons for our policies or our solutions that the other side can recognize as reasons, right? Don't just cite, if you're a Christian, don't just cite, hey, let's build a bridge because the Christian God would want us to do it, right? If you're a Muslim or an atheist, you're not going to buy that as an argument for a policy. Likewise on the other side, right? So that's a good idea. I think most of us would agree that democratic politics goes better practically speaking, we don't need fancy Rawlsian arguments for this. Just practically speaking, you're going to convince people faster if you use arguments that they buy, right? If you use premises that they're going to buy into. Duh. I mean, that's just a practical fact about politics. So to that extent, everybody's a Rawlsian. The hard question is, but wait a second. Are you saying that I can't appeal to scientific facts if the other side doesn't buy science? Right? Some Rawlsians think, yep. It's not clear that Rawls thought that himself. Because after all, Rawls did think there were truths and falsehoods about what's reasonable or not. Right? Some arguments he thought were reasonable, some weren't. There were truths about that. So he didn't think that all truths were unimportant. Moreover, whether you put Rawls aside, at some point, we've got to recognize that we're going to argue about sources of evidence. Right? Part of what we disagree about in politics is not just the facts, but whose sources of information to trust in order to get to the facts. Right? Right now in our society, we spend a lot of time arguing about that. Think about what's happening right now at the CDC and RFK Jr. Part of what he's saying is, I don't trust scientific journals. Scientists are like, well, we don't trust your homemade science either. Who's right? Well,
Depends on who you ask.
depends on who you ask. At some point, we're going to need to fight that, and we're fighting it out now by attempting to see whose side can give the best arguments for their methods.
But unfortunately,
one of the
I don't think people
Yeah.
are convinced by arguments on these things. Unfortunately, I think they're,
Well, as I already said, I agree with you.
yeah, I mean,
Right.
it isn't, what is it, the Mike Tyson quote, everyone's got a game plan to get punched in the face. And then, like, that's what people need, I think, and to really be like, hey, we have measles outbreaks. Hey, we have, polio back. Shit. Well, maybe we did do something right with the,
Well,
and
that's where I was going.
yeah.
Because when I use the word argument, evidence, I don't mean just the sort of things we're doing now. Reality, right, can intrude.
Yes, it can.
Reality, as you say, like Mike Tyson, could smack you in the face.
Yeah.
And that's happening right now with climate change. It's happening with vaccines. We see it in Texas, where recent reporting, people in Texas reporting that who were anti-vaxxers saying, I think I was lied to, meaning by their social media feeds, right? Realizing that, actually measles can make you really sick.
Yes.
It can put you in the hospital.
Yes, it can.
It can kill you.
Yes.
So, that's what I meant. Reality, you have to test things against reality. The best way to do that is to actually use science and to do it in the lab before it comes and smack you in the face.
Yes. Right. That's right. Yeah.
But, as we're finding out in real time, if that doesn't work, unfortunately, reality will find a way. And let's hope it's not too late. So I think what I was saying is, Look, when we go back to Rawls, the idea that some people have, and they credit to Rawls, I think incorrectly, but they say, look, we can't appeal to truth and facts in public argument. Well, Rawls was living at a time when he didn't take seriously, I think, that anybody would give up on science. He just, back in the 70s and 80s, that wasn't taken seriously.
Yeah.
Now, we have to take it seriously. So we suddenly are in this situation where we have to do what Rawls didn't think we needed to do, which is stand up for evidence, stand up, as you just did, for reality. Right? To say to people like, no, you can't make up your own facts. And if you think you do, just wait. Wait to see what reality thinks of that. So, that's what I meant.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I mean, it goes back to the beginning, what you said about, truth is tethered of sorts to reality, and that's at a fundamental level, I guess you could say. And that's, again, that's very, very important, because you do start to realize and find out pretty quickly. And I just wish we don't have to do this real-time experiment on the human population or the U.S. population, but I mean, and it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate in a lot of ways. So,
it is.
Of course, there are many things in your mighty book which we have not got to, and I am aware of the time, and I am aware of how much your voice is taking a beating here. So let me just ask the final question. I guess you end it sort of, I think, in the conclusion about how do we use epistemic humility and epistemic disagreement in using truth in politics. I mean, I've talked about epistemic humility with my friends about all the time, about how people need to do that. They need to do more of that. This idea that I got to genuinely be, honest and humble about what I don't know. And that's okay. That's fine. And also, I think, as you point out, how can you know how to agree or disagree, or to have a good way of dialoguing with people? So yeah, how do you kind of see this, pragmatically, of how we could do things?
I think you're right. That epistemic humility, which is really the idea that, first, I could be wrong about things. I don't know everything. But also, second, it's not just that. Not just that. Not just saying, I don't know everything. Because there can be some people who think, oh, they don't know everything, but they're such a genius. They'll eventually figure it out. Right? On their own. Right? So the other aspect of epistemic humility that matters is the idea that we can learn from other people. We don't know everything. And I can learn from other people.
Yeah, you and I both have, we have 2 PhDs, but there's a lot of things I don't know, but you can teach me a lot.
Well, likewise.
Right? Yeah.
And the same for everybody who's listening.
Yeah.
Now, that attitude is very much a democratic attitude. Because it says, it invites you when you're feeling it, when you're actually practicing the attitude. It's very much an attitude that asks you to collaborate with other people and to treat them, with respect.
Yeah.
So, when we're thinking about how to renew our institutions, particularly those epistemic institutions that help us gather evidence and think more clearly and get over our biases, we've got to think about how to structure those institutions in ways that encourage us, not discourage us, from epistemic humility. That's why one of the institutions that is the most reformed are the institutions, and they are institutions now, of social media platforms, which I don't think any of us really think tend to encourage us to think that we don't know everything. They tend to encourage us to think we do know everything, and to tell us that it's easy to know. It's just a click away. So I think, I'm a philosopher, not a policymaker. I deal in big ideas. I'm not the person to ask if you want to build a bridge, know how to get from A to B. But what I can do is tell us, the people that do those things, what values they need to guide in constructing institutions, including institutions of education. One of the things that we need to do, one of the things we need to reform is we need to make public education a practice that encourages epistemic humility lifelong and is accessible, less expensive, more accessible to all people. We all agree with that. That's a truism. What's harder to do is to start with yourself. To reform an institution requires individuals. And that means putting your money where your mouth is, humility-wise. And remembering the next time you're clicking on a news story or sharing an outraged tweet, remembering to think, am I really just building up my identity here? Can I think again? Can I reflect? If you do those things, you're living democracy as a way of life. You're doing what John Dewey counseled, which is to live democratically is to live openly. You can't be so open, he said, as to let your brain fall out. But what you do need to do is to collaborate with other people, to treat with them with respect, and to treat them with humility. That's democracy, and that's also how you pursue truth.
No, I mean it's well said. I mean I fully agree with all of that, and I think it's, but it can be much easier said than done, of course. So, Michael, thank you so much for giving me your time and energy and wisdom, and it's a real treat. You're always welcome here. Would always love to talk to you about many of these things, and so big thanks for coming on. It's a true delight.
Thank you so much.